Local boy makes good. The ship was anchored in Double Bay, Sydney, for 10 pleasant days. Many visitors came on board, and the boys and the crew were treated royally. As always in the big ports, I rushed about a great deal, achieving little, keeping appointments, dodging traffic, looking after the ship's buying, and the ship's sick first, with difficulty, entering the ship in and swearing this and that, and filling up always more and more copious forms, until I began to fear there would be a paper shortage in Australia. Later, with more difficulty, entering the ship out again. The regulations for the management of ships in Australia are voluminous and apparently unending. Supervision is strict and I suspect costly. The passion of a new people for government seems combined with an undue emphasis upon the complete satisfaction of their insularity to such an extent as to make the visits even of non-commercial overseas ships a form-ridden burden to those who bring them. I hesitate to criticize my countrymen, the warmth of whose personal welcome far more than made up for the officiousness of the infinite forms. Yet it is a curious fact that of all countries, Australia is least visited by wandering vessels. May not this overgrowth of regulation have a little to do with it? Sydney, I gather, without difficulty, wants and almost demands tourists, being assured rightly enough that there is much in New South Wales and the Commonwealth generally to attract and to interest them. Sport, plenty of this. Beautiful scenery, a fine climate, and so forth. Tasmania is a beautiful place. The Great Barrier Reef is unique. There is the koala, and here and there even an aborigine. The cities are large, prosperous enough, at least on the surface, and possessed of most of the usual amenities for the entertainment of visitors. There is perhaps an overemphasis on the necessity for closing the front doors of bars at 6 o'clock sharp every evening, and the frigid ferocity of the average waitress, asked to serve something at any other than the few set hours, seems well buttressed by an impregnable wall of regulations. With a few exceptions, it is conceivable that the arrangements, even those affecting our primary needs, of most of the hotels could be improved. In a country possessed of so many advantages, populated by carefree but resolute people, noteworthy for their courage, their hospitality, and their resource, it is a pity that such minor blemishes, which a little common sense could easily remove, should be allowed to continue. A survey, strict almost to the point of savagery, was made of everything my unfortunate vessel had on board upon her arrival. All the heavily dutiable items were placed under seal. I had little of these, and an accurate inventory made of everything else, so that when the time came to leave Melbourne, my next port, duties could be paid on all that had been used or consumed, food, paint, ropes, canvas, everything. If I cut a sail while the vessel lay in an Australian port, I should have to pay duty on the canvas. If I painted the ship, I should have to pay duty on the paint. If I bought fresh eggs in Australia and fried them in lard from America, I should have to pay duty on the lard. I had known of all this from my previous experience in the grain ships, and brought very little into Australia. I knew Melbourne was a good place for storing such a ship as mine, in food at any rate, and I meant to take in provisions there for the voyage to New York. In the meantime, we lived on fresh food bought ashore, as we always did in ports, and did such work about the docks as was possible without the consumption of dutiable goods. An expert in the customs house, that well-populated temple of parsimonious precepts by circular quay, wished to charge the ship with light dues for the Bahama Islands. We had come from New York, hadn't we? I had cleared from New York to Sydney. If we had gone from New York to Rio, we must, he argued, have used the Bahama Lights. They are on the way. The force of this argument was a little upset by the fact that in order to head towards Rio, we had first, being a square-rigged ship, to make easting past the Azores, and we had on that passage, and indeed on most others, used or seen no navigation lights whatever. I pointed out, moreover, that on the passage from England to New York, I had made my landfall on Watling Island, and had made good use of several of the Bahama Lights. I had then, I went on, gone into Nassau, where, so far as I was aware, no manner of expense to which the ship could be subjected had been overlooked. Yet at Nassau there was no mention of this queer subject of the Bahama Lights. I must add that I did not pay for them in Sydney either. The visit of the little ship to Sydney attracted a great deal more attention than I had bargained for. Being accustomed to go into ports and out again almost unnoticed, Sydney people and Australians generally have always been interested in their own history, most of this being recent enough still to be discoverable with some accuracy. Perhaps the similarity of the old frigate to the ship in which Cook had first sighted the coast of New South Wales and sailed past the entrance to Sydney Harbour, and her resemblance to many of the ships in which their forefathers had come to the young colony, appealed to their imaginations, but the good citizens of Sydney have always been intensely ship-minded apart from history. Naval officers were the first rulers, and military officers incidentally the first exploiters. Many of the early residents looked curiously upon ships as a means of escape. In the first years, ships brought the very food that saved the settlers from starvation. From then until today, ships have been the link with the outside world, and now Australian and New Zealand ports are almost alone in the world in the spontaneity and depth of their sincere maritime interest. The waterfronts, apart from much of the unfortunate neighborhood of the Forlorn Yarra, are a pleasant Sunday afternoon walk. Visiting warships and unusual vessels of all kinds attract great attention. I found myself for once a newspaper figure, was asked to broadcast, and hobnobbed a little, very briefly, with the great. This was transitory enough to be pleasant, but when the press of citizens eager to visit the ship made it profitable for a ferry service to be begun from Circular Quay, and the populace began to encumber the decks so much that we could do no work, it was really time to call a halt. I had always taken the view that anyone who was sufficiently interested in ships and the sea to come to our gangway should never be sent away. It was a standing rule of the ship, though for legal purposes the usual no admittance sign had to be hung out, that no one genuinely interested in the ship should be refused permission to see her. The flow of visitors had until then not been immoderate. Indeed, in most ports there were none, but in Sydney they came by the thousands. There were old mariners, veterans of the Cutty Sark, the Romanoff, the Thermopylae, and the Simba. There must be more real old salts in Sydney and Melbourne than anywhere else on earth. Young mariners, yachtsmen, naval officers, artists, musicians, editors, pilots, economists, ministers of state and high officials, and hundreds of the citizens, all crowding in the ferry. I saw after a few days of this that as it was unfortunately impossible to chain down all the belaying pens, and I rather liked the little ship as she was, the ferry service at least would have to stop. Some enthusiasts were so taken with the ship that they tried to carry away even the red customs seals from her, prying them and their accompanying red tape from the doors where officialdom had set them. This was too much. There was a penalty of 100 or something for that kind of thing against the ship, of course, and not against the enthusiasts. I had then reluctantly to exercise some effective manner of control over at least the non-maritime section of the visitors, and name set visiting hours, a thing I should have done at first, but I had had no idea there would be so great a crush. It seemed to me that Sydney, with the vast cruising ground of the whole Pacific so close outside, would have been an excellent home for the little ship upon some future occasion. But I was bound round the world, and could not think of staying anywhere, and I had been born in Melbourne. The days in Sydney passed pleasantly enough, though I had my worries of a serious kind that I well knew could not be fought off much longer. The boys went sailing, horse riding, and surfing, and the older of them took trips into the country. I tried to ensure that they had the opportunity to see at least something of the real country, not much of which, if the truth be told, penetrates in these days to the great cities. As far as cities go, Sydney might as well be San Francisco, except that it is on the other side of the Pacific and has only one harbor bridge. In these days, an inhabitant of any white city anywhere, if he were to sleep and suddenly wake up in any other white city where his language was in use, would find little difference in his new environment and would not be incommoded. But the country of Australia, the slow growing charm of the great bush, the quiet beauty of the vast sun-filled plains, the wonder of the long, almost untrodden sands, offer much to interest even the jaded world traveler, if he has the eyes to see. I sailed out of Sydney Harbour on the morning of December 18, 1935, bound to Melbourne in Victoria. We beat out from Double Bay to the wild delight of the two pilots who had come for a holiday and the disgust of the boys who did some of the work. Airplanes flew overhead and launches followed us, taking photographs. There were many people on the cliffs and in the balconies of the houses watching the ship as we passed by. We beat again a fresh nor'easter and flood tide from Double Bay to the Heads. Some of the boards were very short. Many steamers came and went as we beat there, blowing on their sirens and dipping their flags, though the usual seamen's strike was keeping most of the Australian vessels at the wharves. The pilots were the stout fellows, Captains Brew and Finlay Murchison, the same Scots-Australian who had the bark Watara many years and distinguished himself by saving her threatened rigging with a preventer stay that he took aloft himself, and a bad blow off the horn. The brother of the good mariner Murdo, who had the Lobo and the James Craig. It was years since they had had the opportunity to handle a vessel under sail. They took turns at the wheel, and would allow no one else to go there, and tacked the ship alternately. When we were out, we spliced the main brace with a flagon of strong rum belonging to an artist who had come aboard in Sydney. That was a morning's beating. It was a grand day of sunshine and fresh wind with the little ship, as if aware she was on show, turning back the foam of the harbour with a sweet grace. Under a full press of sail she beat and beat, thrashing her way out of the harbour, through the ferries, and past the steamers, going about now almost beneath the high rocks of a precipitous cliff. With the shouts of the sailors and the booming of the backing sails echoed on the cliff sides, now a few moments later swinging on her heel almost on top of the Sow of Pigs shoal, backwards and forwards every sail drawing to the best advantage, and the ship heeling and picking up more motion and more life as, tack by tack, she approached the heads. We were clear at last, and backed the main yard. The pilots departed, very pleased, and we stood out to sea alone. With the nor'easter a fair wind, I should have been delighted had it blown us to Melbourne, but that, to say the least, was extremely improbable. The nor'easter at that time of the year is a passing wind, apt to bring nothing but a sudden shift of the wind heavily to the south. Melbourne was about 600 miles away to us, but I knew we should be fortunate to reach it in less than 2 weeks. The Australian coast is often a difficult one for the square-rigged ship to navigate. My admiration of the great cook had increased a great deal since first we made our Antipodean landfall. We were no sooner outside than the cook came to me aft to give me a letter from the superintendent of the General Hospital saying that if he went to sea in the ship, they would not be responsible for his leg. He had a very bad tropic ulcer which had defied treatment for months. The letter gave him instructions to remain in Sydney at least 10 days, reporting at the hospital daily for skilled treatment. And he brought me the letter when we were at sea. Well, I should have to save his leg in spite of him, or cut it off. It was a grim job. The beat round the Australian coast to Melbourne was the most difficult short passage of the whole voyage. It was midsummer then, but that seemed to make the weather worse. Sudden shifts in wind, violent onslaughts from the west and the southwest, a huge and confused sea, these combined to impede our progress. The good nor'easter did not last 6 hours. When once we had beat out against it, and we did not have a fair wind again until we were come to Wilson's promontory. The wind persisted from the south with the pall of the graying sky closing in. The glass dropped steadily, and at nightfall of the second day there was that queer faint moaning in the rigging that tells of a coming gale. It came. It was then Christmas week, a week ushered in by a hard gale and driven out by a worse one. For the time I had to leave to heave the ship to. The weather became too bad to stand on against it. First we had, in that brief space of 24 hours, 4 winds at gale force, each from a different direction, with the sky gloomy, threatening, and the sea ugly and so confused that the bewildered ship, not knowing how to shape her motion in order to maintain her balance, threw the pots from the galley stove and the plates from the table. The increasing gusts grew and grew until at last it was a violent gale from the south-southwest. From this direction it blew at gale force during the next 36 hours, with violent gusts so strong that the rigging, with the ship down to a minimum of canvas, was strained severely. I had to heave to. I goose-winged the close-reefed fore topsail, and hove her to with that, and the small storm fore topmast staysail, and the mizzen staysail, showing to the storm. Under this canvas she lay to very well, though she rolled heavily, and put the fear of God into our accompanying artist. The sea was wild and fiercely turbulent, and the wind screamed, but she began in the afternoon, still hove to dry her decks. We lay out the storm in safety this way, being indeed better off than most steamers, for steamers must, as far as possible, continue to pound into whatever comes along. But I found afterwards, when I could get observations, that we had been driven almost 200 miles out into the Tasman Sea. Christmas Day found us still trying desperately to get this back, and the gale still blew, though moderating. The sea was lumpy, ill-tempered, and confused. It was savage weather, and all hands were out most of that Christmas Day. Sunny Australia. All hands looked at me with some resentment for coming to such a place, for this was the stormiest coast we had been on. It was probably most unusual weather, but it is my sad experience that the most unusual kind of weather is very common indeed everywhere. We were blown about on the short run quite a lot, but we lost only one sail and the ship suffered no damage. It was the last day of 1935 when the ship arrived at Melbourne and anchored inside the Gellibrand Light in Hobson's Bay. It was exactly a year since we had arrived at New York. Again I felt the curious mixture of mild elation at an important stage of the voyage being now behind me, and uneasy alarm amounting almost to a sense of impending disaster. The plain truth of the matter was that the condition of my finances had long been worrying me. The sum of my resources was now 30, and I had a ship at some 28 human beings to get halfway round the world, and I had some fever. I had known when I began that this question of finances would be a worrying one. I was not wealthy, far from it, but with a generous advance from my American publishers for a book and some magazine articles, and with the earnings of my other books and whatever else I could write and sell, which was not much, I had hoped to get along. I lost heavily in New York and recovered little from insurance. I had various unforeseen expenses which made a further hole in my already small funds. The running of a ship such as mine was an expensive undertaking, though I looked after everything myself and ran her as inexpensively as I could, without stinting anything, and seeing that all hands were as contented as possible, and above all well fed. The ship cost me about $100 a week to run, reckoning wages, insurance, port charges, and all expenses. I paid 15 hands, and though I gave no handsome salaries, I paid what I could. Most of my sailors were from the grain ships, and I paid them far more than they had been receiving there. I paid myself nothing. As far as possible, I advanced the sailors and the officers, and petty officers their wages as they earned them, not wishing to pile up a large account to be met on my return home. The necessity, when I had been unfortunate enough to ship an incompetent, to send him back at my expense to the place that bred him, had caused me serious loss. It might well be asked why, since I had not a reserve of funds sufficient for the voyage I had set out, did I expect someone to give them to me? I most certainly did not. No one was behind me. No one would give me anything. I had taken especial care to see that there was no suggestion of any manner of sponsoring for this voyage, which I was determined should not be spoiled by any commercial considerations. I was not sailing this ship to exploit anything or any natives or any person. No scientific body, quite properly, had the remotest interest in the vessel. As far as I knew, none ever wished to have, though I should have been pleased to do what I could for science, any science, at no expense. It seemed that the scientists could get where they wished to go faster and more comfortably by other means. The oceanographers required trawlers, and the geographers had more need of theodolites than of vessels. I was entirely a private citizen, and I was further cut off from participation in any of the ordinary sources of employment for my ship, since she was not registered as a commercial vessel. Not that there is much loose employment for odd ships anywhere on the earth these days. Well, I knew all this when I set out, but I was resolutely determined to complete the voyage. I knew well enough I was buying a great deal of trouble when first I bought the ship. I could have afforded to take a smaller vessel, a ship which needed no professional crew, and could have kept the seas at a tenth of the cost. But I had been, well, almost inspired to buy this ship. So far as I knew, no one else would have saved her from the break-up yards. No one else would have made any sailing ship available for British youth. No one else would have tried to sail this lovely ship round the world. Any one could have done so, she had been for sale some time. So I started, and I depended, after the serious setback of the New York disaster, on resource to show the way. I could have taken, as they came forward, decent people. To share in the enterprise, to sail in the ship a while and breathe pure air and see strange scenes. I could not and would not seek such people, and very few ever came forward, very few. I sailed most of the way with the guest cabins empty, certainly on all the difficult passages, with the sole exception of that from Samari to Tahiti. Any idea of running a ship on a round-the-world voyage purely upon the contributions of such odd citizens as desire to come, and actually do come, is foredoomed to failure. I knew that. There have been many such schemes, but no successes. To the best of my knowledge, only one vessel has circumnavigated the globe successfully with paying guests, the American schooner Yankee, Irving Johnson, master, but that was a carefully organized and painstakingly planned expedition for the purpose, and moreover a voyage that was planned and executed with no other idea. I would not run my ship for paying guests. It is possible, by putting up with a great deal, to sail a schooner in that manner, but it would be foolishness in a full-rigged ship. It was indeed the high cost of having all my boys with me which was largely responsible for the serious condition of my finances. As I approached Melbourne, without the boys, I should have been well off. True, many of them had paid something to be here, but the total sum secured in this way did not come to 1/6 of the costs of the voyage. I had been, I fear, so anxious to avoid any possible taint of profit-making that I had leaned over backwards, and the premium was too low. Indeed, one of the American boys told me afterwards that one of the principal reasons for his coming was that he could not live so cheaply at home as he could with me on this round-the-world voyage. Well, there I was, near enough to bankruptcy, arriving in my old hometown. The outlook was worrying, and the recurrent attacks of fever did nothing to relieve it. Yet I believed as stoutly as ever in the voyage, and I was not unduly dismayed. I had sailed the ship to Melbourne, and by thunder I would sail her home again. To give up the voyage while the ship floated was unthinkable. For a while, however, it looked as if I might have to. My 30 went the first night. There had to be advances for the crew, and there must not be the slightest hint of financial insecurity. They had to be fed. The ordinary running expenses of the ship had to be met. I earned a little by writing for some Australian papers, and from photographs. This was a temporary help. The distressing debility and bodily weakness which followed the prostrating attacks of malaria were a further severe handicap, making any kind of effort extremely difficult. It was only by great exertion of will that I was able to go on, and to preserve an unbroken front towards the world. How long I could do this I did not know. For the ship I thought a long time, but there was no joy in my visit to Melbourne, and there were no happy reunions, though I was well received. Though not much as in Sydney, I was still the local boy made good, the local boy who had gone away vaguely somewhere or other in a ship, and now returned after many years with his own vessel. The maritime enthusiast and the yachtsman were good to me, good to all hands. I was asked here and there to speak sometimes, though I hated this, and the listeners abhorred it far more even than I did. All sorts of distinguished citizens were eager to inspect the vessel. I was at my wits' end how to get funds. I thought of raising my needs by mortgage, for a sum 1/5 of the value of the vessel would have been sufficient, but I could get nothing either by mortgage or bottomry bond or respondentia bond or any kind of advance or loan. I was informed that the vessel, not being commercial, was not regarded as a pledgeable property. A commercial vessel in need of funds by bottomry bond has usually 3 securities: herself, her cargo, and the freight to be earned by delivering the cargo. The money advanced is usually for the purpose of allowing the vessel to proceed with a voyage and collect. The freight. The advance is always very well secured. In my case there was no freight. There was nothing but the vessel. True, she was free from encumbrances, but the voyage was worth nothing. She was earning nothing, could not earn anything. Her value in case of a forced sail in those waters did not exceed what she might bring for conversion to the Tasmanian timber trade, which was then doing rather well, or into a lighter. Who wanted a full-rigged ship? She was worth no more than she would bring. Her replacement value, the obvious value of the material in her, the sum I had paid for her and for her alterations and improvements, these things did not count. It did not take many visits to the bankers, the brokers, and the shipping experts to be convinced that they had no money either for my ship or for her voyage. In desperation I even thought of the money lenders, who daily advertised their exceeding benevolence and willingness to advance sums from 5 to 5,000. These gentlemen were unanimous in their disapproval of the whole enterprise. What advance money on a property that would then sail away? Nothing doing. Bring them in some good bricks and stone, they said, a nice paying hotel, or something like that. Then perhaps they would talk business. I could very well understand the money lenders' reluctance. It might be difficult, in the case of my failure, to force a sale in a distant port, harder still to supervise it. Money lenders, whether bankers or investors, invariably look upon the worst side of with the utmost pessimism they can muster. This is not a little. Things began to look serious. After some days in the city I returned to the ship at Williamston and looked round me at this worthless property upon which no money could be raised. She did not appear to me to have shrunken value. I was now anxious only to raise sufficient funds to get out of Melbourne and sail directly either to New York or to England, but daily my situation became worse. I could name no sailing date. The day was fast coming when no device would suffice to hide the grim fact that I had no further funds. I had no rich relations. There was no one anywhere to whom I could turn, no one indeed to whom I would turn. I had good friends, but this was my mess. Then one day there came on board a slight fellow with a sharp face, one Cecil Thrillip, which was not his name, who asked if I would go to an island in the South Seas after some gold. go after gold. I would have gone after a treasure in post holes and bilge water to get out of Melbourne. Then, and yet there was something queer about this gold. To begin with, I did not take to the expression of open frankness on Mr. Thrillip's dark face. Indeed, there was no such expression there. Mr. Thrillip was a swarthy man, lean, with a morose countenance on which there sat the expression of a rather worried louse. I could not help wondering why, if this gentleman knew so much about gold, he was not a little happier in his expression. He might, I thought, have had some gold to spend, but Mr. Thrillip, I gathered in due course, was a promoter. He was interested then in the promotion of a company for a gold mining venture on an island in the South Seas. At that time new gold mining companies were being formed every day. Recent exploitations at the Fijis, at Mishima, and in New Guinea had been successful. Gold, for some obscure reason connected with the incomprehensible workings of our economic system, now that it was more useless than ever, was an even more valuable commodity than it had been before. Almost any ass, it seemed, could bring forward a proposition, and someone, the public, I suppose, would finance it. In this instance, so far as I could comprehend the details, some ass knew about some gold on some island, and Mr. Thrillip had formed, he said, though this was a lie, a company to exploit it. In order that no rival concern should discover the whereabouts of this El Dorado, it was necessary to transport the company's expedition there in secret, hence the need for a ship, and there were few odd vessels about in Australian waters. Why not buy a Tasmanian ketch? I asked, but these were all busy in the timber trade, and also were scarcely suitable. There were no small steamers available. The company, moreover, had no need of a permanent vessel. They merely wished to land the expedition secretly. Once that was accomplished, and the claims paid, their men could look after themselves. It all sounded rather interesting. I had the whole voyage long been looking for some unusual kind of adventure, and none had ever reared a tired head above the horizon. Now here was Mr. Thrillip with his talk about gold. How opportune it was he did not know, but I knew. The severity of my own economic stress did not mislead me into being too greatly off my guard, but I was eager to believe the best of this enterprise. Mysterious as it might seem, I could not help wishing that someone other than the pleasant Mr. Thrillip, who gave out a scant air of prosperity, or even of much status, had been the emissary of this secretive company. I did not know at first where the island was. It seemed strange indeed that the transportation problem could not have been solved more simply. But schooners are scarce and steam chartering is costly, and to buy a ship is usually ruinous to the uninitiated. It bothered me enough. There was the minor objection that my vessel, not being a commercial ship, could not be used for making money purposes, but about this Mr. Thrillip said with great truth I need not worry. My ship could not be chartered, but would I accept a directorship of the excellent company? It would then be a mere fortunate circumstance that a director chanced to possess a ship of his own, in which to transport the gold-getters secretly to the island. My acceptance of a directorship would bind me to secrecy. As for the cost, this unfortunately was where I was vitally interested. These would be made up to me partly by means of my director's fee, and partly in vendors' shares of the company. I did not care about the shares, but I was in serious need of funds. Well, I went into the matter then fairly deeply. I met another of the principals, an elderly gentleman, who was obviously sound. I met the company's lawyer in Collins Street, and after that saw a great deal too much of that handsome but largely useless thoroughfare. I learned where the island was. I met the man who had been there, the famous prospector who knew about the gold. This gentleman unfortunately appeared to me to have about the same sustenance as Mr. Thrillip. It was conceivable that he was of use in the gold business, which began to appear to me a mighty queer one, but in any other capacity I should have regarded him well with some reserve. He was nervous and a little shifty. He never looked for very long in the same direction, and had an expression on his overfed face as if he never expected anything he said to be believed. However, it seemed that he had satisfied the experts, whoever they were. I never did discover that the find he claimed to have made was worth investigating. There were moments, however, when I was oppressed by a vague suspicion that these experts were more concerned with the gold to be dug out of a company in Collins Street than from a mine on any island. But I fear that about this time I was developing into a suspicious person. The long and short of it was that I agreed to associate myself with the enterprise, at least to the extent of taking the expedition to the island, but I insisted that my resignation from the directorate should take effect automatically on the day of my departure from Melbourne. Somehow I never did quite believe in all this expedition. It was too opportune and complete a solution of my financial difficulties ever to come true. The island I discovered was Sud-Est, in the Louisiades, where gold had first been discovered some 40 years earlier. The main lode or reef had, however, never been discovered. The prospecting member of the expedition, he of the Quirinius continents, claimed far as I could make out, to have made this important contribution to auriferous science. Sud-Est may be a most attractive island. I never saw it, but it suffered one grave disability so far as I was concerned. To get there I had to go again through the accursed Coral Sea, and in the cyclone season. This circumstance did not appear to bother the Collins Street gentlemen very much. Perhaps they were unaware of its significance, but it was a serious thing. A Coral Sea cyclone can show a West Indies hurricane how to be really bad-tempered. To be caught in that reef-filled sea in such a disturbance was apt to be fatal. In undertaking to make a voyage of this kind, I well knew that I was adopting desperate measures. Yet what was the alternative? The abandonment of the whole expedition and the stranding of my crew. No, I had to go. There was nothing for it. There was nothing else for it. Well, there I was. The prospector was there, with a gentleman to accompany him to check his finds, and a roustabout to look after the camp and do the cooking. I was anxious now to embark these fellows and be on my way, with my director's fee used to pay my bills. This it would have just done nicely. There never was any thought of profit in the scheme so far as I was concerned. Days passed and nothing happened. I began to read inspired accounts in the newspapers of an expedition for treasure to an unknown island, under sealed orders and all that kind of thing, and then I made the alarming discovery that the company had neither funds nor existence. Mr. Thrillip had said it was entirely underwritten. It was not. It was not even registered. I insisted now that these formalities should be rushed through with the greatest haste. Mr. Thrillip still said that there was no bother about the money, that he said was tied up. It was all ready. Possibly there were occasions when Mr. Thrillip told the truth, but this was not one of them. There was no money. The company now made an appeal to the public through a hastily prepared prospectus for funds, having previously announced with gusto that no shares would be available. The public, naturally somewhat shy of such an enterprise, produced no funds. The brokers were equally baffled by this queer concern, about which so much had been given out mysteriously to the daily press, and yet so little was known. Since this was at this late hour the only possible means I had of escaping from Melbourne, I was rather badly caught in the ghastly botch. I'd been in Melbourne 3 weeks. I was all ready to depart, except for paying some bills. I was now hopelessly committed to the ungolden enterprise, for good or ill. I could not see that any good would ever come of it, but I had to get out of Melbourne. I was desperate. I was now so short of ready funds that I often went without meals on my many exasperating trips to Melbourne, but because of the malaria and my worries this was no hardship. I was not hungry. When I came to Melbourne I still had some money to my credit in London and in New York, accumulated royalties, and so forth. This I had cabled out and spent, though I had been trying to preserve it for necessary expenses later on. My need of funds would not pass with my departure from Melbourne if I ever did get away from the place. It began to look as if I should not. All this dreadful time I was still the local boy made good. No one had the vaguest idea of my real predicament. As in New York with the ship on the rocks, the telegraph messenger boys had trudged through the slush and the snow to me with messages of congratulations from friends in England on the successful accomplishment of the Atlantic passage. Now I was the envy of the juvenile populace, and almost the pride of my former instructors. It is, thank God, difficult to receive the acclaims of the citizens of one's own town, and I shall never have them. It would have been worse in Sydney, yet it was strange to come in there, owner master of this last frigate, this last world-wandering, full-rigged ship, if nobody, not even myself, knew very clearly what the voyage was all about. At least it had the semblance of romantic attraction. As I fought through the days, striving desperately to get away from Melbourne, and returned to the ship each evening, there came nightly on board something of the grim pageant of all the wasted years. I watched the unrolling again of the past years, the reopening of the half-forgotten chapters of my youth. I had been born in Melbourne, had gone to school there, and then to stay, and then to sea. I had spent there 15 undistinguished years. Some of the years had been unhappy ones, and I would have preferred to forget them, yet I could not. Other schoolfellows came, and I saw myself again at school, in Essendon, not liking it, poorly clothed, the son of a poor writer of verse, who gave his talents and his life for his ideals, and his strivings for the improvement of the lot of the lower classes, suspected of pacifist tendencies, for this was war-time and the school was fiercely patriotic, and of ideas for the improvement of the economic system. I worked in glass bottle works in the holidays to get money to pay sports fees, which were compulsory, and buy books, and in the mornings delivered newspapers to the homes of many of my fellow students, unknown to them. for the round began at 5:30. Time and again I was hauled before the assembled school and exhibited as a horrible example, because I had lost my school cap, and until the holidays came and I could go back to the bottle works, I had not the money to buy another. There was no money at home. My father had died then. Still young, I was 13. The exhibitions to the bitter ridicule of schoolfellows bite deep at that age. I found myself still hating the very thought of that school, and I did not wish to see any one from there save perhaps companions in indignity. Yet they came good teachers, for it was only the head who exhibited the bad examples. Classmates, this fellow and that fellow, now chemists, school teachers, businessmen, naval officers, happily married, many of them, and doubtless most estimable citizens. I should have been glad to see most of them had I been so profoundly worried by my parlous financial position and the desperate steps I was taking to get out of it. Yet it was ironic, for they envied me, some of them. They envied me, and my stay among them was a nightmare. From Melbourne, too, I went first to sea. From the ship I could see the wooden wharves where I had first looked at square-rigged ships, and the windows of the glass bottle factory where one could watch in a brief spell the laden sailors going up the river. How often had I watched from those open windows! There was no glass, and longed to be in one of those ships. I had on the afternoon given up each week to sport. I was too tired to play, and had little interest. Escaped from the school and gone to the wharves, there to walk a while slowly and listen to the wind from the bay blowing in the high riggings, to gaze on figureheads and cutwaters and the grace of ships and the ways of strange men, and ruminate upon the attraction of it all. Escape, escape. This had come to be all I dreamed of in this city. Years before, and I had escaped, and now was returned with my own ship, a thing of which I had never dreamed, and was more greatly in need of escape than ever. I was entertained by the Literature Society, though I knew not why, and spoke over the air with a distinguished general, and was hailed by the sea scouts, and read queer things I had not known about myself in newspapers. I walked again the wharves, whose planks I had worn years earlier, looking forlornly for a job in anything that floated, from which I could never find work in a vessel of my own flag. I saw too long again the sun-swept busy streets I knew too well. Into the ship they came, these youthful ghosts, from the past, schoolfellows, shipmates, fellow reporters from Tasmania, fellow cadets from Captain Suffern's school at Albert Park, mariners, laborers, journalists, whalers, old friends, some of them, whom I was glad to see, but most had only been acquaintances. Here was the reporter, good fellow, on whose motorcycle in Tasmania I had hurried to my first murder, and had botched it because I could not bear to see the scattered scalp of the bloody corpse blown round the walls of his poor hut. I had been a navvy once in the early Tasmanian days, before I could find newspaper employment, striking the dull earth with a duller pick. Here came my comrade in that employment, who hated it as much as I had, and was in business now, and hated that. And, oh God, so many it hurt. The fever hurt. My mariners and my boys had begun to grow restless. When would we sail? I wished I knew. The gold company of Mr. Thrillip was an utter failure. It passed out of existence without ever having drawn breath, save in publicity. But at the last moment, when all hope seemed gone, Another group interested themselves in whatever proposition there might have been and took over the prospector and his scheme. They also wished to take over the idea of sending the expedition in the ship, but they reduced my director's fee, which originally had been barely sufficient to cover the expenses of the voyage, to an amount which just covered my indebtedness. I was caught. I could take it or leave it. Well, I took it. The expedition joined the ship after I had been a month in Melbourne, and I paid my bills and departed. Even the prospect of a cyclone in the Coral Sea did not appeal me after a month of Collins Street. I was bound for Samaria in Papua, port of entry for the Louisiades, by way of Auckland in New Zealand.